All right, ladies and gentlemen, can I suggest you stay in your seats because I'd like to invite on the platform Tony Blair. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an important feature of these conferences, a conversation for literally 15 minutes only about issues which are current and important to the person who's going to be on the platform. There are going to be several of them in the next 3 days. I'm joined by Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, doing many things since, and just started a new institute, Mr. Blair, in London. But we've got 14.5 minutes now to summarize your view of the scale of disruption that there is, because that's been at the heart of much of what's been discussed in the last 2 hours already.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here at the conference, Nik. I think the scale of political disruption is going to continue. I see no evidence of it slowing down, whether in the West or the East. In the West, there's the challenges of populism, left and right. In the East, I think there's a huge question as to whether countries go for nationalism or go for reform. And all of this, the background to all of it, is a world of accelerating change. So I think that change, whether it's technology, changing the way we live, work and think, it's the geopolitics, with the enormous power that China will have in the 21st century and other emerging powers, or migration, waves of people that are going to change the politics, not just of the West, but obviously of the countries from which they come.
What about the fact that there are those who say that much of what is happening could have at least been put on the agenda, could have been foreseen, could have been thought of as thinkable, rather than many being taken blindsided, left field, right field, by things they never appeared to be thinking of, particularly the speed, the depth, and the handbrake turns we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, I think the scope, scale, and speed of change is the defining characteristic today, and I would say this is going to continue. I mean, if you look at Europe today, you know, the politics of Europe are still under enormous pressure. I mean, okay, we've had Brexit in the UK, the Macron victory in France. You've got new political parties of the left and the right, starting in Europe, getting a foothold in the political systems. And so everywhere you look, there's change, and it's happening because the world's changing so fast. I mean, the next generation of technology is going to pose enormous challenges of change to every single country in the world. And the real question is this: in a world that's changing fast, if you don't change, whether you're a country or a company or a citizen, you're going to get left behind.
What about national borders, respect for law, respect for international treaties at a time when, as you know, the Iran treaty is under challenge, when you see what's happening in North Korea, non-proliferation and so on? I just use those, and also for what Russia has been doing in Ukraine and Crimea. But the respect for law and the respect for treaties and the respect for institutions which have largely kept stability since 1945.
Well, I think this is extremely important, but here's what I think the challenge is. That what's happening under the pressure of change is that countries in the West are tending to a politics that becomes, or is in danger of becoming, more protectionist, more isolationist. People want to look after their own national interest, are less concerned about cooperating with others. Okay, so that's one risk. Then on the other side, as emerging countries try and cope with the challenge of change, there's a risk, I think, that they go for nationalistic politics as a substitute for reform. Okay. Now, what both of those things mean, in my view, is that right at this moment, you need greater international cooperation, greater ability to handle things like trade, climate change, terrorism on a multinational an international basis. And we're trying to do this right at the very point in time when people, in a sense, because of the pressure of change, want to look after their own interests first.
We've just had corporate leaders on the platform largely saying, and I'm using words they used, how scared they are, how overwhelmed people are about the information, the scale of information, the level of information, the volume of information, and the impact that is having. I'm not saying anything new, but I'm coming round to the question of you're lucky enough not to be a prime minister anymore, if I may put it that way, not least because being a leader is incredibly tough now because of the speed and the volume and the multiple nature of what's happening at very high speed.
So here's the kind of paradox that I see in politics today. That leadership has never been more important. Okay. If you look around the world today, you can import technology and you can bring in capital. But the one thing you can't do is import your leadership. So governance and leadership become critically important. But the paradox is that, in my view, the relationship between social media, which I think is itself a revolutionary phenomenon, and conventional media, mean that leaders are trying to lead and govern in circumstances where they're subject to these huge waves of sentiment and emotion. And really the choice for leaders is, when you see this great wave of emotion coming at you, do you get your surfboard out and surf it, or are you prepared actually to take a stand and let the wave break over you? Now, I think today that leadership, that ability to stay firm and strong, is more important than it's ever been. But I think the way politics is conducted and the role of social media makes that harder than ever before.
Of course, when you were elected, the music in Britain was things can only get better. I put that to you, not necessarily to remind you of that, but simply as a baseline from which to judge where things are going now. So much more is uncertain. Could it be that politicians and corporate leaders are going to have to say, I can't guarantee that things are going to get better, but we'll keep them as stable as we can?
No, I think people have got to be much more active than that. I think the key thing for political leaders today is to be honest with people about the scale of change and the challenge, and then to have the courage and the determination to make the changes necessary.
Can they still get elected?
I think you still can get elected on the basis you're prepared to face people up to uncomfortable difficulties. I mean, if you look at the Macron victory in France, you could see that in this way. Look, if you look at what's happening here in Saudi Arabia at the moment, I mean, I just want to say this to the conference. I really can't imagine this event happening in this way a few years ago. I mean, this 2030 vision, and not just the details of around the economy, but the changes that are happening in Saudi today under the new leadership, is, I think, the most important and the most exciting thing that has happened in this region in the last few years. It's vital that it succeeds. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be challenges all the way. But if it does succeed, it's going to change not just Saudi Arabia, it's going to change the region, and it'll affect, I think, the security and stability of the rest of the world. So, you know, this is a very, very important moment. And I think when I look around the world today, I'm looking constantly for the leadership, whether it's in the West, the Middle East, or the Far East, that's prepared to say to people, change is going to be tough, but we can navigate our way through it. Here are the changes we've got to make in order to make that change work for us. And leadership with the courage then to see it through. And I think the only answer, for example, to the populism sweeping the West today, okay, and what's the risk of this? The risk is the right wing decide to go into a sort of isolationist position and target immigrants. Okay. The left decides to go anti-business and takes the agenda back 40, 50 years, when actually the future for the West lies in staying connected, educating our people, building the infrastructure of the future, and making sure that the types of changes you've just been discussing on this platform are changes people feel I can look at and respond to optimistically.
But far more than when you were still in Parliament and a political leader, you've got disaffection from a significant part. We can call them millennials, but there are probably up to the age of 45 in many countries. Those below that age are expressing disaffection in various ways. Do you think age, when it comes to leadership, and we're talking about the Crown Prince here, we're talking about what's just happened in Austria, we're seeing it in France as well, that age is something which has got to be confronted head on as a way of keeping the next generation, many countries are under 26, keeping them in tune with and having trust in politics and the corporate sector?
Well, you know, as I get older, I'm less and less in favor of discriminating on grounds of age.
But
I actually think it matters more. I mean, I think it's important, for example, here in Saudi. You know, you've got the Crown Prince, who's a young man, and you've got the 70% of the Saudi population, I think, under the age of 30. So, of course, that matters. But, you know, what matters most is the spirit and whether you understand the ways the world is changing and are prepared to go with it. And so, for me, I mean, although I think a lot of Western politics is in danger today of going back into left versus right, to me, the true distinction in politics today is between what I would call the open-minded and the closed-minded approach. Right? The open-minded sees globalization as essentially positive, but thinks you have to spread its opportunities and deal with its dangers. The closed-minded wants to shut itself off from the world. And you can see that in the abuse of religion, you can see that in trying to shut down trade agreements, and you can see it in isolationism. So, to me, the age, yes, it's important, but the most important thing is that you know what should happen with the country and you're prepared to take the measures necessary.
But I'm just wondering more broadly than just the kingdom here, whether you think that this actually, given the enormity of the disruption we started this conversation talking about, that there's more chance of at least a relationship between the disaffected or the deeply concerned under the age of 26 or 30, if there's also a leap in age when it comes to leaders both in the corporate sector and also the political world.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's important that people stay in touch. But, you know, my point is only that there are young people with a backward-looking view and older people with a forward-looking view.
Final thought, if I may, Mr. Blair. What are the unthinkables coming down the track which should be being thought about at the moment, given the speed of what everyone here is wrestling with, often probably quite privately, and not wanting to talk about it too openly because talking about vulnerability is not very fashionable. But what kind of things are coming down the track, not in 10 years or 20 years, but 10 months or 20 months or 10 weeks or 20 weeks, that should be on their minds about which you would get back to that phrase you used right at the beginning, profound, deep, and speedy?
I mean, I think you can talk about obvious things like the threat from North Korea, for example. But I would say the following are the three big questions, I think, in my view, that you can think about globally. In respect of the West, it's whether this populism settles and you return to a politics that I think is going to be more productive in the long term, or whether it carries on fueling discontent, disruption, and surprising political outcomes, which could then unsettle the economy. I think in the East, it is around whether, particularly in respect of China, when after this party Congress has just been, are the reforms in China going to deepen? You know, is China going to take the next steps towards modernization? I hope and believe it will, but I think that's a critical question. And then I think here in the Middle East, can it find its way to rule-based economies and religiously tolerant societies, which is the only future that works for the region. And so I think these are the big challenges. I think in each case you can say, there are pluses and minuses. But broadly, I think if you take a step back and look at the world in the last 30, 40 years, for all the trouble and the difficulty, humanity's continued to make progress.
Is optimism a good planning principle at the moment, or is caution now more a planning principle, given the enormity of shocks and disruption?
Well, it's always as well to be realistic, but I don't believe that certainly I think cynicism and pessimism are never good, good qualities with which to view the future. And I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I mean, the challenges are there and they're clear, but the fact is the world is changing in a way that, I mean, if you think of, I think in my own country of my father's generation and how they were brought up and the opportunities that young people have today, for all the difficulties, humanity is carrying on making progress. And as I say, the fact that we are here from all different parts of the world in Saudi Arabia having this conference at this time, I think is an indication that progress is still marching forward.
It's sobering, one final thought, it's sobering that a report out just a few days ago in the United Kingdom talked about how 30% of the jobs in your former constituency in Sedgefield in the northeast of England will probably disappear in the next 5 years.
Yeah, there's going to be huge disruption, but here's the thing, there are ways through it. Technology will displace jobs, but it can also create jobs. Technology can also transform the way we do healthcare, we do education, and transform it better. So these challenges are always being posed by a process of change. The question is, do we have the leadership and the right values and the right spirit to handle that change, to mitigate the risks and access the opportunities?
I look forward to reflecting on this with you again in a few months. Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you, Nik. Thank you very much. Thank you.